how long has it been for the three of you and your university and working remotely? Do you have a sense of time?
Time's hard to judge, yeah. But so I think the Chronicle of Higher Ed called us Campus Zero, which makes it sound like we originated all this, like Patient Zero. But we were the first large public to go remote, and that was March 9th. It
Wow.
was actually the very end of our winter quarter. And so we had to very quickly, it was like our last week, and then we had to go through final reviews and final exams. And then after spring break, we had to start up a brand new quarter. So we've had the experience of both ending and starting with remote, which is a little different than the semester-based schools that were switching in the middle. And we're only dealing with students that had already been registered and already involved with classes. So I think it was a little different, two different modes for us to have to do.
So at ASU, we were on spring break. I think it was March 13th was the Friday. So the way it went down was, I think Thursday was a number of phone calls between people. And then Friday, we were on, not sure when the decision was actually made, but the Monday after spring break, which would have been the 16th of March, we were remote fully. But it was only going to be for a couple of weeks at first. And then now it's obviously been through the entire semester. So we were just coming out of spring break. I also had a conference that weekend. There was an ACSA conference, and we had board meetings for the JAE that weekend. And the board meetings were all on Zoom. So starting on Friday night, for me, Friday afternoon, all day Saturday, all day Sunday were board meetings. And then Monday was my first studio remote. And I think that's been about 8 weeks or so.
And on my end, McGill also selected Friday the 13th to kick all this off, which was great. And to their credit, they just pushed pause for 2 weeks entirely, just stopped classes, everything. And while, gave students a time to move back, move out, allowed faculty administrators to make some adjustments, and then resume the rest of the semester. There's only maybe 3 or 4 weeks left at that point. So we're done. We've submitted grades, et cetera. So it's been a similar time frame as ASU, but now we're completely done.
It's interesting because when this all started, as you guys have described, I don't think anyone really quite knew how long it was going to last. So that's why some of the schools kind of shut down for 2 weeks or a week or whatever it might have been. I'm curious, like how much panic was there? If you're in the middle of classes and all of a sudden the rug gets pulled out from under you and you have to adapt, I guess basically overnight, right?
I'm not sure it was panic. There was definitely what, are you serious? Are we really doing this? And then it was, do we really need to do this? Because we were so early that there were definitely people saying, do we really need to do this? Because no one else had done it. And so it was, the messaging around it was really carefully done. And I think the decision was made on a Tuesday. And then we had the rest of that week to prepare and kind of get things set. And then by Monday we were remote, but at that time it was, early March. And so we actually still had students able to use the studio spaces and the wood shops and things like that. We were just asked not to convene in person. And we also did a very different thing compared to other universities about, our dorms are still open. We've got about 2,000 students still on campus. And so we tried really hard to not make it something that, even though it was quick, we tried really hard to make it not feel sudden. And there was a lot of really, really careful messaging to try to make sure people realized that this was serious, that this was part of, bigger public health issues. And we also thought we'd be coming back, right? So we thought we'd be coming back after our spring breaks. We thought, switch, have time to do deep cleaning and then come back. And so it's been less panic and more just sinking in like, oh, this is a long-term thing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We have a little bit different context here at ASU because of the scale. So we had 15,000 classes go remote in one day. And the response to that was obviously varied. Leadership is varied. So in terms of who was panicked and who wasn't panicked, I think went really back to the personalities of leadership. But the way ASU is organized, it's extremely top down. So when Michael Crow met with our president, Michael Crow met with the provost met with the deans met with the directors met with chairs, and the message was consistent throughout. So I think the messaging and the consistency of that and the clarity of that really helped a lot. But I think that the panic I wouldn't describe it as panic. It was a bit shock. And then 2 weeks in, it was more dread. Like, are we really going to be doing this? And students lost motivation pretty quickly. And then things kind of picked back up again. But about 2 weeks into it, it was, I think, pretty rough, but not really panic, just kind of shock.
Sure. Mass panic. Yeah, maybe not. I mean, that's another thing too, is because no one really knew how all this was going to evolve. How has it been looking back, the past 2 months? How has things changed? How has the students and the teachers adapted, and how they changed over the course of that time? Because 2 weeks living in isolation, let's say, more or less, is kind of one time frame. But when you get to the month mark, that's a little more stressful. And then now 2 months, it's a different deal.
Well, I have to say that I do want to touch on the last question about panic. I think any panic I've felt associated with this change is dwarfed by my panic for climate change. But that does relate to the next question or the comment that you had. In terms of, I've been most shocked and disheartened by the desire to keep education exactly the same as it was, to kind of repeat all the same formats and everything that we have been doing in architectural schools, and trying to reproduce that and replicate it online, rather than seeing this as an opportunity to question some of our assumptions and rethink some of our modalities of learning, et cetera. So I think that there are tremendous opportunities within this shift, not just to, the fact that we're online or something, but to really think through some old habits that we've taken for granted at this point. And so I don't know. I hope we can start to imagine and reason what those possibilities are with more concern, rather than just trying to, shift things over to a different format overnight. I understand the kind of panic associated with that, but there's some important, bigger pedagogical considerations inherent in that.
And Kyle, I would totally agree. And I think a lot of that has to do with the expediency and the intensity that we had to make the pivot, that it was hard to be thoughtful and hard to kind of have the bandwidth because you were just dealing with so many tactical issues. And I know for myself, because I work best when I can go from strategic to tactical and back up and down. And I was just so dwelling in the tactical, it was actually really tiring for me. And as soon as I could start to raise my eyes a little and sort of see how some of these things do reflect to either ideas of how we teach or the impact that the COVID was showing us on blue skies in Delhi and other ways that we were saying, okay, wow, this is profound behavior change. And there's some good things about that this is the level of behavior change that we're going to need to deal with climate change. And we've seen it happen. So we now know it's possible. It was at great cost to the economy that we can't sustain. But it has shown us that you can get science-based behavior change, which for me is super optimistic.
Yeah, I have to agree. I'm actually kind of strangely optimistic about a lot of this because I'll give you a really quick example. We had talked about some pretty major changes in our program before all this happened. And there were definitely some people who said, I don't think we can do that, And now all of a sudden we're questioning if we're going to give lectures again, which is the foundation of every education, right? Like you can't not give a lecture. So I think that the changes that happened in very strategic or very tactically are going to allow for us to strategize much more clearly and much more open-mindedly, because we've actually experienced a few things now that some people just thought we would never do. And I also think that the shift very quickly showed the cracks in a lot of our assumed practices and teaching. And I think the students were actually the sort of clearest voice in all of this for me. And they were the ones who sort of said, yeah, like, of course, why would we sit through a Zoom lecture? Makes no sense. So I think that the students are actually, many of them were able to adapt more quickly than a lot of the faculty who tried to continue the paradigm of what we were doing face-to-face.
And just replicate and have kind of a simulacra. So I think the other thing that became really apparent is I think we did have enough time to do some surveys and to get a sense of where our students were and where they would go to, and if they were going to stay in the area or go to different time zones and what kinds of access they might have. And it became really apparent to us, other cracks that Mark, you were talking about, is I don't think we really fully realized how many of our students were right on that edge of being food insecure, housing insecure, and we're dealing with really difficult issues, not just about internet access, but about things impacting their families, dealing with, for many of them, kids that were no longer in school. And very quickly it became apparent, not so much in that winter switch, but for the spring switch, of students' number one question was, is this synchronous or asynchronous? Because for many of them that just had unstable internet access, or they had kids at home or caregiving, they just couldn't do the classes during the times at any scheduled time. And so if they could have the asynchronous, and so if the asynchronous wasn't an option, they needed to find another class. And we've still been finding out more about our students than we really, in detail, that we didn't used to even know or ask about, that is really shown us how they're not able to be as resilient as we would love them to be, because there's a lot of risks in their lives.
And we didn't quite know as much about the students before because they were coming physically to the classroom or the studio, and it's kind of like their personal life is divorced from the studio setting, right? And assuming someone's not rolling in with Gucci shoes, you can't necessarily tell, right, what kind of economic background they come from. It's kind of sort of a level playing field in a way, I suppose.
Yeah, and it goes both ways, right? Because you're in people's homes, right? And so you get to see things that they may or may not want to show you. And so they don't have as much privacy because, we try to stay on the right side of being intrusive, but we definitely needed to know what time zone they were in, if that was going to be a problem for them,
right.
We didn't need to know what time zone they were. We needed to know that if our time zone was going to be a problem for them. And, right. Those kinds of things helped us be more effective, but it is at a certain point, they didn't have to tell us. But then now they're also offering things around, when you go 10 minutes over, it's actually really a huge problem for me.
Right.
And when in the past, some students would hang out after class and some would not, we didn't ask why. And now we still don't ask why. We just say, tell us if this is a problem, and we don't need to know why. But the more you can help us understand your context, the better it is.
It also becomes really apparent when you're looking now into everybody's room, who has a space to work, who doesn't. It goes for faculty as well. I'm very fortunate. My wife is working from home. We both have offices. So we have a place that we can sort of close the door. I have students where you see multi-generations in the same room at the same time. And then you see other students who have workspace. And it's just not the same. So those sorts of things, I think, affected students' resiliency more than the shift, right? Like the actual having now to work in another spot was a really big deal. Not having school to go to made the differences really much more readily apparent.
Right, because in studio they all have approximately the same
right.
desk and workspace, and that's definitely not the case now.
Do you feel like your relationship to your student has changed? Like, do you feel closer to them in a way, more as a friend or a counselor or a shoulder that they can count on to understand what situation they're in now than you were before?
Well, I think it's a little bit less in that kind of personal sense that you're describing, but I think what I'm hearing from Marc and Renee and and resonates with my own experience is that I think there's a new and different, and I would say better sense of solidarity with the students, that we understand who they are, where they're coming from. And we are learning the lessons daily that the lives and careers of current and future students are going to be unlike that which shaped our own lives and careers as faculty and administrators. So I think that that's coming into focus in a very clear way. And I know it's going to have some impacts. We can't keep doing all the kind of same conceits of architectural education that we've been maintaining for decades. I think there's going to be some fundamental shifts, but a lot of that does come out of a sense of day-to-day solidarity and knowing who these people are and where they're coming from and what they need.
So jumping off of that then, what specifically are you thinking about, Kyle? Because it seems like you for sure have some thoughts, and Marc and Renee, you seem to kind of agree that there were certain assumptions made that, in other words, we needed to just try and recreate what would typically happen in, let's say, the studio specifically. Now recreate that on Zoom as best as possible. But what things were the three of you thinking that should be different, could be different with this kind of technology, not specifically Zoom, let's say?
Well, I think one emblematic example would be the absurdity of the jury system, the idea that we have a juridical metaphor as a way of evaluating architectural knowledge at the end of the semester, that this is the kind of primary and assumed tradition is bizarre to me. It remains bizarre to me. The kind of juvenile behavior of a lot of reviewers on those panels, the crazy power geometries that emerge, and I just think there's a lot better ways to evaluate one's progress, one's contributions to a discipline, one's understanding and capacities. And so I think, we're starting to see some much more interesting methods of delivering feedback on student work. In the worst cases, I think it is just trying to reproduce the jury system via Zoom, which is always a disaster, and I think a kind of failure pedagogically. So, but that's just one kind of example. I think you could pull that back out and start to ask questions like Marc and Renee have been intimating about. Why do we need to have lectures, or why can't we incorporate some of all the pedagogical thinking of the last decade, which points to team-based learning and other forms of kind of structuring education. But I'm sure Marc and Renee have some good examples as well.
I think just overarchingly, the shift from having me be the one who produces knowledge and gives it to a student to a model where people are co-learners or co-developers of information and of knowledge. If you look at that across a class like Studio, it changes the review system completely. I don't do final reviews in the same way that most people do. I don't give individual desk crits ever in Studios. And students are a bit shocked at some point when I introduce that. But we set up a lot of different group situations and games, really. And those games then translate to people developing a sense of kind of studio culture that's sort of lost now because we don't have to be in studio all the time. So we really have to be much more intentional about how we create studio culture. And I think a lot of peer-to-peer learning can aid with that or help with that. And one of the interesting things was the shift from our on-the-ground studio to the remote studio through breakout rooms and other things. The dynamic didn't shift at all. So the students were actually very comfortable with that. So we had established that rhythm. And then when we got online, that still happened. When we did our final review this year, we had, and you were part of it, David, we had multiple critics per student. And we had multiple reviews happening at the same time. The review lasted much shorter time total, but students got a lot more feedback, multiple forms of feedback, different types of people. That can open up a lot of doors and open up a lot of opportunities. We can also invite people from many different places. We're not specifically bound to place, right? So we had people from a lot of different places in the world on the review, and that was actually really helpful. But I do think there's some. I don't want to paint it as the best thing ever, because I do think there's some drawbacks to only having virtual or remote conversations. So I think some form of hybrid education is going to come out of this as a model that we can move forward with. But I do think we need to really rethink the big big structure of how knowledge is understood, how we learn.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of there's a democratization in some ways of the power structure in a Zoom, like you're in a grid, or anyone can kind of speak up. You're not, the professor isn't necessarily like pinned in the corner unless you intentionally do it that way. And so there's the potential for some things to just be shifted that way. And I would agree that the breakout rooms could either be very much like physical breakout rooms, or there could be ways that students can use them in more unprogrammed ways. And you have to be more intentional about what you're setting up. And it's always good to kind of be clear about what the purpose is of doing these things, because you're having to set them up in an active way. But for me, I think what I've actually learned is how much I value the face-to-face, because I've always been one that have said, conferences, don't make me travel across the country if we can just do some stuff virtually, because I've always really enjoyed the fluidity of being able to invite people from different places just to drop in and not have to worry about, travel and the carbon footprint of all of that. But I've been having these amazing dreams of like being in these beautiful lecture halls and having some amazing lecture, and I'm with friends chatting on the side of the room, and then the room erupts in applause, and I wake up feeling, oh my God, I missed that. Like, so I'm partly energized by, like, I do kind of feel like I was at this great lecture last night, but then I also am like, oh my God, I really, really missed that. So I find myself actually longing for very specific things, the kinds of energy that gets created in big groups or in smaller groups or in formal settings or informal settings. So I think for me, when we do come back, because we will be coming back, I'll be more clear about what I'm valuing and when I'm choosing to go to the trouble of asking people to show up in person and commute or to fly or whatever they're going to do, and what I'm hoping to get out of that. Mm-hmm. And not necessarily saying I'm going to structure everything, but I'm just going to be more clear in my own mind of a certain energy that you can get and a certain energy that you can't get. And so for me, it's just been, and I don't quite know what I'm going to do with that yet, but I'm just definitely been enjoying my dreams lately. We're doing things that we can't do now.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's for sure. It's interesting because I think for this process for everyone, I mean, you are all in leadership positions, but also you're going through it in some way the same as everyone else, and very, and with your own lives. And there's this kind of connection between the individual personal human being and their dreams and how, they're going to lead a group of people that directly ties to the experiences they're going through. It's a very, I was going to say wonderful, maybe that's not the right word, but it's a big social experiment at this point.
One thing we've talked about a lot is that I'm on Zoom calls a lot, and I'm sure Renee is as well. I'm sure Kyle is also. I had counted up the number of hours I was on Zoom from the 13th of March to last Friday when we had an exhibition, and it was over 200 hours. And the majority of that were with a handful of people, right? So my director, associate director, and that was pretty much the majority, right? Studio took up a big chunk. But the thing that we're missing is the casual connection in front of the coffee shop, right? So I haven't seen a whole bunch of faculty, and I've had to, and this is very much against my nature. I'm not super social. And so I've actually set up a number of happy hours that all faculty could come to. And some faculty came to it, some didn't. And we just said hello and caught up and stuff. But there are 3 or 4 faculty that I really haven't talked to very much that I would have seen weekly, and those are the things that I'm kind of missing in a lot of this. And so those conversations are oftentimes not super substantive, but they can be, right? Mm-hmm. That can be, okay, let's talk about, I saw this, or let's talk about that. And that kind of interaction has really been lacking. And I'm not sure how we bring that back.
It's pretty hard to do because you have to then set up a time and agree to come. And I've been actually just barging in on a number of student Zooms. And so I just said, okay, give me a list of when the student groups are regularly meeting and ask if it's okay for me to come. And so I'll just come for like the first 10 minutes and, say hi, kind of say, look, I have no program here. I just am available to answer any questions, and I may not be able to answer them all, but I can at least write them down and get answers for you. And I just want to hear how you're doing. And those have been, a little awkward for sure, but, I just stay for like 10 minutes and then get out of there and let them do their own meeting after that, and I follow up if I need to. But I've been getting a few more students reaching out after that, and so it's close to getting some kind of more casual, but it is hard.
That's interesting. I mean, I can see where that would make sense because it's that informal, you happen to be passing by someone, and I've attended a number of these like happy hour things. We've hosted some, and the intention is for them to be like this casual kind of format to kind of shoot the shit. And then if something cool comes up, that's great. But it's really hard when you try and force it. A lot of times it ends up being really awkward, and you need at least a couple people in that group to just lead the conversation, which at that point is not, it feels very unnatural, right? It's a very forced kind of thing. But you had both said that you had contemplated, or someone had talked about lectures going away. How would that work? What does that mean?
So I said it, so I'll own up to it. I had a conversation about 2 weeks in where we had a structures professor, and our structures professor is a hardworking professional engineer who works as an adjunct. He teaches a class at 6 o'clock at night. It's just after studio. It's not the best planned class. It's a 3-hour class. And students would leave studio and pregame before the structures class, meaning they would start drinking. And they just were not interested to sit there for 3 hours. And the person took the class, or he basically taught the class as he would have done it in person. And by 9 o'clock, everybody was gone. It just didn't work. And so sitting in one place for that amount of time was really difficult. And we started talking about it, and they said, if I have to go to a classroom and I have to sit in a lecture hall and I listen to somebody and they're a really good lecturer, I'm okay with that, because I'm somewhere else, I'm with other people, I can do that. But doing it at home, watching a video is really, really tough to do. And most of my students, ASU has a really robust online platform. So most of the students we have in class have experience taking actually, online classes that were designed to be online. And the rule in online is that you pretty much don't go over 10 to 15 minutes per module, and that's a lot.
Wow.
So what students are used to is a 10-minute lecture on something really
6 minutes. Yeah,
exactly.
Wow.
Right. So they're used to a short burst of something, some sort of assessment, some sort of
interaction,
a discussion post, something, and then they move on. And they can do that all in one night, or they can do it over the course of a week. And so I think part of it is that we're dealing with students who have exposure to actual online content. And then when the instructor shifts to online content, which is the same interface, but is trying to replicate face-to-face experience, it falls flat.
Well, that's what the BAC people were saying to us that when we did an early call with ACSA on the pivot to our online education, and the AC and the BAC people were, because they do hybrid and they do online only, and they're like, everyone was like, oh, when you switch to online learning, they're like, no, wait. You guys are not switching to online learning. You are transferring to a remote platform. And, we didn't have time to do the online. And, I've actually been looking into, when you start up an online only degree, it's about $100,000 per course to produce something really good. And, people will do it for less, but that's kind of the 100 to 150 is kind of what I'm hearing. And that's with like multimedia and like, good videography and a lot of, you to do a good 6 minute, you have to script it.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just talk, And so how you produce all that and the time it takes to really do that well is not a trivial thing. And it definitely was not what that was not the exercise we embarked in.
So Renee, we're actually launching an online degree in 2021 in MArc. And we have Ed Plus here, which is helping us. And we actually have, it's incredible. I don't know many other places that can do this. So Ed Plus is supporting the development of this with instructional designers and a lot of equipment. It's a huge investment. So certainly me talking on Zoom to studio is not the same thing, for sure. But thinking about how we go back now, does it still make sense to ask people to be in an hour-long lecture twice a week? Can we divide that content and use class time to do other things, right? Can we use that class time to have
flipped classrooms or whatever?
There's lots of other ways of doing it. So when I say it, I don't think the lecture is I don't know that it's necessarily dead, but I do think we should be rethinking it.
It goes back to what I was saying, is like figure out what's the valuable part, right? If you're going to get 100 people to come and sit in a lecture hall, you should be using that time really, really well.
Kyle, did you have any thoughts?
No, I think this is exactly the kind of thinking that I think, schools need to do. I think schools of architecture are pretty far behind on a lot of these techniques, whether they're flipped classrooms, team-based learning, peer-to-peer, online, etc. And I think schools of architecture have a lot of pretty steep learning curve on how to get up to speed on some of these things. But it's all the issues are at least tangible now, and we can start to take them seriously. That we can move beyond a kind of sage on the stage and basically a guild-based pedagogy to something that I think is pedagogically much more progressive and fitting the kind of constituency of students and professionals that we should be serving. So I think there's going to be so many different hybrid formats that it's not going to look. There's not going to be a single model of online or anything like that. There'll be some stuff that's in person, but I completely agree with Renee and Marc that if you are going to get 5 people or 10 or 100 people in a room, you got to know why you're doing that. And it can't just be that you've paid somebody to show up and give a 90-minute lecture. I just don't think that model really works anymore. The models will continue to evolve, and I welcome all of that kind of thinking and inquiry.
So there's something that Ed Allen told me a long time ago, and I think he mentioned it when he won the Topaz, that you get 10%, right? Like every faculty member has this huge iceberg of knowledge that they would love to just impart to their students. And over the course of their semester or their class, he said it's totally scalable. Like whether it's a unit within your semester, if it's your whole semester, your whole class, or your whole body of knowledge, that you've got this huge amount of knowledge that you want to give to your students. But you get 10%. And so if you are choosing well, you will choose the 10% that they get that will inspire them and equip them to get the 90% over the course of their life. Because if you are trying to get them to learn something about structures and materials, which is what Ed taught, you're never going to be able to teach all of it. But if you choose the 10% well, they will go get the 90% over the course of their life. If you don't choose the 10% well, you'll still only give them 10%, but it'll be some random 10% that they've just like somehow hooked onto, and you have no idea what they're going to do with it when they leave your classroom or finish your class. And so just be disciplined, choose your 10%, find ways for them to get the rest of it because they care about it and you've equipped them. And so that has just been he told that to me so early in my teaching career, and it has been such a touchstone for me. And it's how I try to lead groups of faculty as well to think about curriculum, is that, people need space. They actually, if you pack it all in, and that's what we are seeing for sure in these Zoom 50-minute classes. If you use the entire 50 minutes, that's really hard. If you did 20 minutes and had some discussion and then did another 10 minutes, I bet those students would be a lot less tired and a lot more engaged and a lot happier. But it's hard because you'd have to say, I've got 50 minutes of stuff I want to cover. And it's like, well, they're only going to hear 10% of that. So you want to choose that or you want them to choose that?
Right. Yeah. And that's a really difficult process to go through. And it's difficult for me. I like to ramble. But I think the idea of kind of dicing up information into smaller chunks and then allowing students to kind of consume it whenever they want is, totally in line with the way a lot of media is consumed already, right? It's kind of, as soon as you wake up, you're on your phone consuming something, and at lunch you're consuming something, at night after dinner you're consuming some kind of information. So that makes sense to me, but I wonder, is it difficult, because we are now pretty much entirely remotely, is it difficult to know when the students are receptive to that 10% that you're giving? Is it harder to read them to see if they're getting as inspired and motivated as compared to when seeing them in the physical?
Can I just sort of tweak that a little bit?
Sure.
Because I think I want to be really clear. My point is not to like take my, hour and 15-minute, 60 lectures that I have for history and make them 180 lectures. I think that the problem that, from my perspective, I teach history theory and I teach studio. And one of the problems with history is that we end up teaching the masters, right, only, because that's what we boiled down to, because that's the amount of time we have. It used to be 4 semesters, now it's 2 semesters in places, whatever. So we keep condensing the amount of information we can give to students. I'm not saying that I think what we should do is just break up those lectures into 20-minute segments or whatever. But if we rethought how history is understood and what the value of it is, and who is it, who is history, who are those stories, we could actually have students be co-creators in creating a kind of narrative. That is extremely powerful, right? So I don't need to tell students about the 6 projects by Corbusier that are on the top of my list, because I need to tell them because they're iconic and they're important, blah, blah, blah. But if there was a baseline of understanding of history, relative, like Palladio and Corbusier didn't talk to each other. We know that. But if we could open that up and have students actually co-create around those things, it's much more powerful. So I just want to be really clear. I'm not saying that we should just chop up existing lectures into smaller chunks so that they can be consumed.
Sure.
Yes, I totally agree that.
Yeah. And let's also just be clear that that as architectural educators, I don't think we've been particularly good historically at communicating what evaluative criteria are for any particular topic, studio, lecture, seminar, learning outcomes, etc. And I think to do any of this remote, online, any of the hybrids, you have to really understand that. Like that deserves as much thinking as the content itself, because you do need to know how the students are actually, whether or not they're, making any progress or if it's sinking in, et cetera. But historically, we haven't just done that. It's just basically in a lot of studios, the criteria seems to be whether or not the student is mimicking the master, and that doesn't really tell us much about what the student's actually getting or learning. So I think in these formats, it's going to force educators to be much more clear about outcomes and criteria as much as the content.
And I think a lot of times there's been a tendency in architectural education to resist writing down a learning objective or being quantitative or saying that there's these criteria, because it's the sense of the iterative design process being that you don't actually know what you're driving towards, and that you are curtailing solutions if you say that the successful solution in the end will meet this XYZ criteria. But I think that's not what, there's lots of criteria of if you can be measuring how, if the student has been able to synthesize or to be able to apply things in a way that was set up by the premise of the studio, and then bring in more, right? Or so then that kind of like builds in some of the co-creation that Marc is saying, is that you can leave room for open-ended, student-generated things that begin to be assessed that you can't anticipate before you start, but you can actually build into the assessment that you want that to happen, right? And so we tend to be uncomfortable quantifying or writing anything in a rubric in architecture, because we feel like so much of what we hope will happen is something that we can't predict and can't overly dictate. But you can actually, it's just a matter of framing. It can be done without curtailing all the wonderful things that we love about design and about architecture.
I mean, I've always thought that that's got to be one of the most difficult problems to solve in terms of education from the perspective of a leader. Like, how do you create learning objectives for across a school for studio? Because studio in itself has always been this kind of vague beast, at least the ones that I've been exposed to. And whether or not the teachers follow the curriculum or the syllabus is like one question, and how they decide to give what grades based on what criteria. It's all very loose, and my mind hurts when I think about, like, how would you create a structure for a entire school to have some kind of consistency or structure throughout it.
So one of the things we're trying to do at ASU is something that we started when I was at Woodbury, and that the problem I always have with studios is that we oftentimes, they're so personality driven or they're topic driven in ways that's not really useful. So if you know in third year you're going to take this certain professor, and if you pass that class, you have your red badge of courage, and so everyone sort of guns for that. That's not healthy. If you have another situation where you only talk about sight in third year, or you only talk about long span structure in fourth year or something, or only talk about comprehensive in fifth year, you're missing out. So one of the things we're trying to do is actually to take a scaffolding approach where every single studio will approach 10 or 12 criteria in a different scale or a different way. So there'll be a certain site, there'll be a certain type of approach to systems, there'll be a certain type or approach to structure, there'll be a certain scale, there'll be a scale of resolution, there'll be a type of collaboration, there will be a form of assessment, how are you assessing it, who's assessing it, et cetera. So in every studio, they'll have those criteria, and we're mapping them out across all the years. So what that does is it allows us to build out learning outcomes pretty quickly because you follow what you've just set up for criteria. But I also think part of what you described, David, is a lack of communication between leadership or faculty with adjuncts, right? So there are so many times when we hire somebody and we say, could you teach third year? And they're like, sure. And they have an idea of what third year is, but we give them a syllabus that's kind of out of date, not really complete. And then they just run with it and they do what they want. So if we can actually create a more holistic, scaffolded system for studio that's kind of behind the scenes, then it doesn't matter who teaches what, because they plug in and they know that they have to meet these criteria and they can do it in any way they want. But it's actually, we get a sense that the students know a certain something after every studio, and they'll be able to move into the next studio. And we'll never have to have a conversation with a third year professor who says, my students don't know how to draw a plan. Why didn't they learn that in second year? All the time, right? So we can go back and we can say, well, actually they did learn it. So I think that if you take a kind of more holistic view of it and don't think about every studio is doing something specific, and you imagine that every studio is actually integrated, I think that's one way that you can get around it.
Right.
I was actually going to ask Mark if you thought about, maybe I'll let Kyle speak for himself, but I know I've heard him speak in the past about challenging just the notion of studio as the core of architectural education. So we've talked before about, whether lectures could be changed pretty radically. And I don't know if you had the discussion, because what you're describing sounds really sound pedagogically, and I can imagine that would fit together really beautifully. But I'm wondering if there was discussion on the role of studio and the aspect of architectural education that tends to focus a lot on studio as the core and the 90% of the students' time and energy, and whether or not we just adopt that and say that's what we're building on because it is the distinguishing aspect and we would never want to give it up, or whether we want to think about questioning that. And I don't know, Kyle, if you've had more thoughts on that, but I know we've had discussions in the past about studio and whether or not it's a sacred cow.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in some very deliberate ways, at least with my closest colleagues that I teach with, we're definitely trying to break down, those distinctions and kind of demount studio as this, quasi holy thing and a ostensibly secular discipline. And I think that's really important, because that just doesn't reflect how practice works, doesn't reflect how our kind of experience of architecture works. And there's so many different types of people in architecture within the building industry. There's so many other ways that architects need to develop, intelligence and agency in this century beyond just, kind of debates about representation or this facade or that plan, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I think I still value all that knowledge, but I think if there's ways of teaching that, of gaining those skills, having those conversations in a lot of different formats. So I think we can start to break down the kind of monumental aspect of the studio and start to take on some of the monumental tasks of architecture in this century through other formats. And we're ostensibly such creative people, but it seems like we're so uncreative when we start to talk about some of these basic topics and like the centrality of architecture studio. Again, I hope some of these changes, some of these conditions start to challenge our assumptions about that, because how can you run a normal studio if it's all remote? Like, it seems like it's better to break it up, some of those exercises, site, structure, or whatever, into smaller chunks that are more manageable, that are more teachable, have better, more clear learning outcomes, et cetera. I think all of that's a part of the kind of democratization that Renee mentioned earlier. And I'm all for that, primarily because I see it as a flattening of some really disgusting power dynamics that I think, haunt schools of architecture even today. And so, flattening some of that stuff out, being more clear about outcomes and how they relate to content is just, I think, a win-win for everybody.
I kind of wonder, though, how much of these issues with studio have to do with the format and have to do with just the teacher themselves. Because I think some of the power dynamics and things that you mentioned, Kyle, I've certainly witnessed them. I've gone through them. And I've also been through the typical studio format with teachers where it was not that way. It was closer to what everyone thinks it should be, I suppose. So I mean, I don't know if there's an answer to the question, but I feel like also it's just you need to have the right teacher, and the format, can only, I don't know, maybe the format's not the only question.
I think that's a good point to make, because I think one of the problems I run into a lot is that people teach the way that they were taught. And as Kyle just said, we're supposed to be creative, but we don't really oftentimes rethink this. And it takes a lot of work. So I get all that. Where I am right now, the studio is not going away. It's still so important, but I think we need to work within that and change the way that we interact in the studio. So as I said before, I don't do one-on-one reviews anymore. I haven't for a number of years. And just that alone changes things a lot, right? So getting rid of that sort of one-on-one desk crit and doing other things, I think rethinking that, having lectures, having outside critics come in, not just to review work, but also to present work, just changing what the activities of the studio could also be helpful.
Which is a format thing, right?
Yeah,
like the format can support a different type of teaching so that it's maybe a little less dependent just on the individual teacher. And I do have to bring up issues around equity, because we are predominantly a white male profession, and our student body is a little more diverse than what we see in the profession, but we have a very leaky pipeline for a lot of the groups that are underrepresented in schools are even more underrepresented in the profession. And ways that we run studio and all of the many, many cultural aspects that are largely unspoken about the rules of, staying up all night, or certain people that are talented get more time, or, things that just are unspoken but are very clearly power dynamics or expectations, are even harder for people that are underrepresented in the field. And they don't work for a lot of people in ways that are much harder than they are for dominant culture. And so, we don't have these discussions because we talk about the whether or not we're meeting accreditation, or we talk about, whether or not the certain ability to read a plan or something is carrying through. And, we don't have a lot of time to discuss things. And I think this is certainly an opportunity, right? Because there's a giant reset going on. But it's also kind of the wrong time to be asking us to be super thoughtful and visionary and flexible and innovative and creative, because we're all exhausted and we're all really, really emotionally tapped out.
Right.
And we're all really wondering, I really hope that all these things that I'm giving up, and and I speak from a super privileged position, right? That I've been, disrupted and inconvenienced and annoyed, and I feel like I've lost things, but they're definitely not, that we haven't had anyone in our direct family sick or die from this, right? And so, and I have to hope that what I'm doing is helping the world, right? And saving lives, because I'm putting less pressure on the healthcare workers and things like that. But this is not actually I'm not at my best self to be doing all these. I mean, I've had discussions with both Marc and Kyle in many different settings, we've been able to just spin up a lot of amazing things. And I feel like I'm working really hard here to try to connect with that, because I do remember these discussions, and they weren't quite so hard before. Maybe it's because we had, a bottle of scotch or whatever, but this is not easy and not a great time for me, I would say, to be at my best self thinking innovatively about pedagogy.
I completely understand and empathize, Renee, but I also get the sense that this is just a dress rehearsal for a whole set of changes that are going to be happening throughout this century. And that this is just an opportunity. I mean, it's exhausting, yes. But I don't think it's not going to be going away ever, in a certain sense, in my mind. That this idea of like, when can we return, when can we reopen, et cetera. It's like, no, you don't understand change. I mean, some fundamental things have changed in our world. We are in a new world, and we have to lean into that with great optimisms about some of the inevitabilities of it. I know it's exhausting, but I mean, I think some of the best and most creative work in architecture have emerged out of these types of moments, as history shows us. So, I know the exhaustion, and maybe it's because we're at the end of the semester, but I hope that this summer, and the kind of academic pause that occurs in the summer does give us all some opportunities to dig in deep and think through some of these issues and develop new models and have some of that energy again. I'm certainly up for all of those kinds of conversations, because I think it's incredibly important that we use this crisis/opportunity to get some things right and right some wrongs that have been going on in schools, most certainly including the equity issues you just mentioned.
So then dialing it back in a bit to studio culture currently with the pandemic, as it is right now, studio, we've kind of talked about it. It's the potential negatives of it being declared the most important class, but the culture within it that's established by that setting seems to be very important. At least, I mean, I think it is, and it's a weird combination of I don't know, long hours, work, dedication, panic, I think for sure in the studio setting, and some unhealthy food. But when everyone's dispersed and working remotely, do you get a sense there's that culture is able to survive if everyone's working through laptops or through Zoom rather?
Well, I think that question already has in it an assumption that everybody's been working in the School of Architecture building in the design studios, and
sure, the
more schools I visit, the more I see that that's less and less the case. So that kind of, it's referred to as studio culture, which is really just whether or not you're logging hours in the building or not. In many cases, that's been, I think, kind of falling apart, dwindling for many years. And again, a lot of it has to do with maybe it's just a fundamentally different demographic that we're talking about, because a lot of people have jobs and kids and other obligations that don't allow them to stay up all night smoking cigarettes and watching the sixth season of The Office yet again while they're ostensibly doing, building a model or something like that. So I think some of the strongest relationships I've seen transfer over quite literally in the various remote learning contexts. So in some cases, it's actually more clearly structured, the kind of communication and some of those relationships, like the working part of that relationship, because I don't think they don't necessarily want to get online and just chit chat the way they would chit chat in studio, right? They would kind of want to get to work. They want to get, the task done, and they want to sort of get on with other things in their lives. And so in that sense, I think there is a kind of, productive aspect of this in terms of work ethic and things like that as they relate to studio culture, even though there's all these mythologies about, the person who spends the most amount of time in the building wins or something like that. It's just like, that's always been incredibly unhealthy anyway. So I think there are some good parts about that right now.
I think that what Kyle mentions about the sort of decline in studio culture is there are a number of reasons for that. And from my perspective, one of which is that when I was in school in the last century, I had to work at studio because I didn't have a drafting board in my house. And so the amount of time that I spent on my drawing meant that I had to be in school doing that. I couldn't make models at home. So inevitably I had to be there. And that led to late night conversations, that led to some unhealthy behavior, etc. But it was kind of a place-based thing. Students don't have to be in that place anymore. And that this pandemic didn't reveal that to us. That's been going on for a while. The question I have is, how do you then recreate that camaraderie, that sense of community? How do you actually build those, knowing that it's not a default of the studio, but it's intentional? And so if you can intentionally create those conversations that happen, those interactions that occur, you have...
Sorry, Mark, are you there?
Okay, sorry.
You're frozen. Renee, you look okay.
Yeah,
I think you're
there.
unfrozen now. Okay. So you were saying that instead of assuming, I'm going to phrase it poorly, but something like instead of studio culture being kind of like a byproduct of needing to be in studio, that you kind of think about it as a thing. You're designing You're designing for it to happen.
Right. It's part of the design of the studio, right? Like you can't just imagine that students are going to do that. And in some schools, they still do, and the myth of makeup all night, et cetera, is really important. But we don't condone that, and I just think faculty lead this, right? They need to be the ones who really structure how that community develops.
Yeah, I would agree that the intentionality is really, it's a good thing that we have made a lot of assumptions about studio. And Mark, I was just thinking, it's like, yeah, I was in studio in the last century. That makes us sound so very, very old. But it's totally true. But the default was that you assumed students would be there,
right,
and that if they weren't there, they weren't able to do their work. And so, and then you got all the benefits of that osmosis, that kind of like just being around each other, and kind of the both the good and the bad of the kind of competitiveness, or the kind of sense of like seeing what other people were doing, just by being able to see their desk and see what's on their desk, right? So there's some things, again, you could find ways to build in intentionally, but at least you know why you're doing it, and you can explain it more clearly, so that it doesn't segue into some of the unhealthy things. And one of the biggest criticisms that employers generally have of students right when they come out of school is that they have no time management, that they are expecting that they can just do a lot of other things and then get to work, but they have a lot of other social things and things, because they're used to the studio setting. And so how do you find a way to discipline drop into that zone of intense creativity that often it happens at 2 a.m. if you're in a studio? So how do you train yourself like an exercise to know what that feels like, know what that feeling feels like? And, I talk to students that are, I'm mentoring this one student now who's going from community college and discovered architecture and is now starting in architecture. And, and this guy's got, 2 jobs, and he's limited time, right? And so staying up all night in studio, he has a night job at UPS, right? And so he is not going to stay up all night in studio. And he was asking me, like, what am I missing? Because I hear about this studio culture, and I have these classmates that are doing this, but, I can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
And I explained to him, it's if you know what that feeling feels like to be in the flow, then it can, for students that are starting, that will often happen at 2 a.m. But if you know what that feels like, you can train yourself to drop into that, and at 2 p.m, and figure out what that creative flow feels like and be able to trigger it.
Kyle, did you have something to say?
I maybe just to summarize these perspectives a little bit, is just to say one of my first principles is that cognition is distributed, right? And the kind of mythology of the lone instructor and the lone genius student and all that sort of stuff, in my mind, is quackery. And I think we can design education to be staged in such a way that students learn from each other as much as from us. But again, that all of that cognition and thinking is distributed. And if you set up projects and tasks in certain ways that they have to engage each other, to check their assumptions, to see if they're right, have debates about which direction might be best, et cetera. There's a lot of ways in which all those those important interactions that we associate with, studio culture of the previous century to occur in other environments through other media. And it's actually much easier to do today because it doesn't require so much kind of cultural indoctrination, but actually just kind of clear pedagogy and instructions.
And the other component to this is that students today interact very differently. So in studio this past semester, we were doing, we had 2 sites, we're doing some group projects. And I said, okay, we need the following information. Like, let's talk about this. You are one group over here, you're another group over here. The first thing the students did is they created a Slack channel. And it just happens, it was completely normal, right? And while we're on our Zoom calls, it's clear that students are texting each other. They're not using a chat function in Zoom. They're texting each other and they're laughing. And it's just constant communication that's happening. That wasn't, I don't work like that, right? Like, it's not part of my mindset. But the interaction, everyone knows Instagram, everyone's Instagrams, everyone knows what everyone's doing. So how do we leverage that, right? How do we actually take advantage of that rather than bemoan the fact that they're not staying up all night?
Right. I'm also curious if you have seen how the different levels of students or years of students have responded to the condition that we're in, and if the approach to handling the different bodies of students has had to be different. I mean, I'm thinking specifically like first year versus fourth year has got to be, they're different people. And first years are, I mean, that must be in some ways more challenging than the rest of the years.
Yeah, the other component to that is our first year studios are really big. So we have 200 plus students in first year, with 45 in fourth year. So I think there's a level of maturity for sure. There's a level of scale as well. But I think the big issue in all of that is what people have going on outside their lives. Because I think, if you're working 2 jobs and you have a kid, it's totally different. It doesn't matter if you're first year or fifth year. It's a difficult thing. So I think
that's a bigger difference.
That was for me a bigger differentiator than age.
Did you see any students dropping out during this quarantine because they just couldn't follow or didn't, feel like keep doing it at home on a computer versus being in school with their friends and having fun and enjoying it? Like, it's part of it, right? Yeah. You have to be excited. You have to be willing to learn and to be interested in it. And I mean, it's
motivation.
Motivation, interest.
So we were pretty concerned about that because they actually had to actively sign up for an online spring or remote format for spring quarter. And so we were wondering how we would what we would see. And we definitely saw some students defer, but not that many. And so I think that there's, I think overall there is a sense of, first of all, students, I think, really, really appreciate how much time and effort their instructors and their advisors and the IT people and the administrators are spending trying to make this work for them. And I do hear from them now that we just had mid-quarter reviews and, we've got another month plus to go. And they are struggling, and some of them thought things were going to work, and they're not working as well as they thought. And so we're doing what we can to try to make changes or to get additional support. But they're mostly trying to hang in there. And they're also really concerned about getting jobs afterwards.
Sure.
And so the students who are graduating are definitely much more talking about that than the students that are more in stream. They're all worried about the summer internships. But the students that are graduating are probably the ones that are most shocked by, up until 2 months ago, they looked like they were graduating into one of the hottest economies that's been around for a decade. And then all of a sudden, it shifted on them. And so those are the students that for sure are struggling. Yes, first-year students, I think, are struggling. But the ones graduating into this, and no one knows, there's projections all over the place, whether this is a U-shaped, V-shaped, L-shaped economy drop. And we can talk about the context of 2008 and how we're in a cyclical industry and all of that can help a little bit. but it doesn't necessarily let them know, should I get another degree? Should I get a certificate?
Right.
Should I just graduate into this and see what happens? And, we're just telling them, stay on the grid. The grid is big. The grid includes anything that you are using the skills that we taught you. So stay on the grid and you can find your way back or not, but try to stay within the realm where you're using your skills.
Let's acknowledge that the kind of dropout, opt-out question is a very class-based question. That's opting out is kind of a privilege. There's a lot of, in the Ivy Leagues, the conversation is, we're not going to have students in the fall if it's online, because students are really paying $60,000 a year for a unique experience with certain heroes that they have that might be teaching that year or that semester, et cetera, or they really want to be teaching, taking a class from this one person. And so if they're not going to have that personal interaction, then maybe they don't want to spend that money that semester. And so, so obviously that's a kind of privilege to be able to make that kind of decision. If you're working two jobs and you're trying to get an architecture degree to get a different type of career and therefore life for you and your family, you're going to keep plowing ahead and getting your requirements done.
You need the degree.
Moving on with things regardless, right? And so we're talking about very different types of kind of experiences and motivations, and a lot of it is connected to class. And so that's a big part of this. And it is a challenging economy that they're heading into. But again, I think that just brings up or reiterates the point that we need to be much more creative about what we think, who we're graduating and what they're doing in this world within the building industry. It is a very broad thing. It needs to be much broader. The idea that we're just, graduating top designers, for who are going to be designing plans and facades or something like that is again pretty crazy at this point as a position to take. So how we support these students who are going to be doing all kinds of work and a variety of related disciplines is part of the task at hand.
Yeah, Kyle, that's an interesting point, and that's one that I've heard before, and I can understand the logic behind it. But I also wonder, and now maybe it's hard to talk about these things without getting to specifics, but I also wonder at what point does school change too much to where you're not producing the core of designers? Because I think there does have to be, at least per university, some definition of what an architect is. And in some cases, I've heard the argument that, well, the school has to kind of, adapt to reflect what people are actually doing when they graduate. And again, I understand the kind of the logic behind that. But again, I also worry that the education can become kind of like too watered down or dispersed to where you're not effectively producing what an architect should be doing as a defined profession when they graduate. Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. And I'm not necessarily usually on the side of like that we need to be training people for the field. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying that we've been under-characterizing what the discipline of architecture is and does in this world. Mm-hmm. That we've somehow in modernity have narrowed the kind of purview of what we consider to be architecture to be incredibly narrow, with its kind of apotheosis and various, believers of autonomy and that sort of thing, where we actually do a couple of things. And if you're not doing that, you're not an architect. And whether it's the Vitruvius, Alberti, any of the treatises all the way through, I just see a much more cosmopolitan view of what the architect does, how they're engaging and composing the world. And it's a much bigger field and there's a lot more opportunity for design agency careers that are still extremely good designers, but aren't following this very singular model of the kind of white man heroic designer that we've been, peddling for a long time. I just don't think that that's what the architect is, but I know that that's been sold in schools of architecture for decades.
Yeah.
Mark, you're on mute.
The president of our university calls himself a knowledge enterprise architect. Huh. And we have a position at the university called knowledge enterprise architect. And that person's job is to strategize and innovate the university. And that person is creating a certificate program, an executive ed program for presidents and provosts to reinvent what a university is. And her title is architect. And that word is out there, right? And we need to own a little bit more of that. And I don't necessarily think that we need to limit ourselves. So actually, I believe, fully that the value of an architecture education is much more than professional, right? And it's much more than being in an office. It's much more than, a lot of that. And the way in which our culture uses the word architect tells me that, I'm not crazy, that other people see the value of that word as somebody who's a strategist, who's someone who can innovate, who can think systematically or systemically. And so we should own that, and we don't currently own that. So for me, it's more that I don't think we're ever going to have a loss of architects who work in offices. I think that's fine. I think if we continue to try to educate students with the mindset that that's the only goal for them, or the only position they can fulfill, we're lost. I mean, we're not going to, we're not going to survive. There's no reason for us.
So I think when you were talking, David, about dilution, I think, there is something about accreditation that provides that minimum and the consistency. And they don't dictate number of classes or anything. They just talk about these are the ways that we think students should be coming out of any school that has an accredited degree, right? And so there is a sort of assurance of a safety net that there's the base that's there. They don't tell you how much time it takes to do that or how many credits it takes. And so I think what we're talking about, if we're trying to say there's a broader definition of what a graduate with an accredited architecture degree does after they graduate, then what we're actually talking about is not dilution, it's actually crystallization and intensification, right? Like, can we get to ED's 10%? And can we crystallize what is that 10% that will allow you to go on to either be a really successful architect in the way that is traditionally defined now of practice, or to do other things that really use those skills in ways that are related to the built environment. Or then the next group out there is that they're not necessarily related to the built environment, but they're looking at systems, or they're looking at things that might have the need to have that lateral simultaneous thinking that we train so well. So I don't think we're talking about dilution. I think we're talking about concentration in order to create more space. And right now, if we just fill our curriculums up with things that are traditionally defined as what we always think architects are going to need to know because we're aiming them all towards a conventional idea of practice, then we will have fluffed up our curriculum with stuff that we don't necessarily think all of them are going to benefit from. But if we can be disciplined and be really, really focused and really, really good at understanding what are the essential pieces, then there's all kinds of possibilities that someone can do with an architecture degree.
It's very exciting, and also it makes me stressed. It's such a difficult problem to solve because the skill set of the architect and their ability to be successful in a variety of things, and the profession itself, I think now having to evolve to engage more readily other professions to have agency, and a number of things that you all have mentioned, is for sure necessary. It's a complex problem for sure. I did want to ask you three, do you know if the universities are going to be opening in the fall? And if they are not, and remote learning has to continue, what will you be doing differently in the fall as opposed to this quarter or semester?
We need our crystal balls. I don't think anyone knows,
sure,
right? Until we have a better handle on the public health information, on the vaccine, on the treatments, on the testing. There's a lot of unknowns. And so I think that it's going to be partly based on new information that might start to emerge over the course of the summer, and also on the values of the university leaders, on what they're willing to do, and then some on the when do we need certainty and when do we need to be able to say. But, I can say here that because we're on the quarter system, we're going to wait to decide until the end of June. And I think those that are in the semester-based schools may not be able to wait that long. Mm-hmm. But we're hoping that if we make the call later, options will be more clear, and we'll actually have more options to choose from if we delay than if we were to have a choice now. And we know there's some things that we're going to need to do, and we know that until there's a vaccine, gatherings of over 50 or 100 are going to be inadvisable. So there's a few things we know. We also know we're committed to having as much in-person interaction as we can, and we're pretty confident that we can do a certain amount. How much, we don't know, but we are committed to doing that because it's something that's, I think, going to be manageable and just super important.
The message from our president is that we will be open in the fall, and that's where it stands. So that's great to have him say, but that's not our reality. So we have a number of scenarios that we're working out, and they basically go from completely in person, everything is okay, to completely remote. So in the middle, we have a number of different options. One of our biggest issues is that we have a number of students who, because of the pandemic, are just not going to be able to get visas. So there's no way that they're going to be possibly on campus in the fall. And so
or there's going to be travel bans, right?
Right. So it's just not going to be possible. So one scenario is a kind of low residency program where we have students in studio for 4 weeks at a time, or 5 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever it might be. And you cycle through that. And if you're coming from India, for example, your on-campus time would be at the end of the semester, where you can still get your CPT and all that stuff worked out for the year. So if we do that, students would be remote the other portion. In terms of lectures, we're thinking about every other day, every fourth day. Like, we have a series of different options that we're working through right now to reduce the number of students in class at a particular time. So we think that the completely face-to-face version probably isn't going to happen because of Arizona's governor and other things that are going on. And we can't get students here from day one, but that's the official word from the president. The other side of it, though, is completely remote, and we are hopeful that we're not going to be fully remote. If we are, we'll be better prepared because we've done this once and we have some lessons learned. But we do think some sort of hybrid model is going to happen, and what that looks like, we're not totally sure. But we have had to, we've had a number of webinars with accepted students to try to talk through some of these, because we have had, the past 2 years, our enrollment has gone up, our admits have gone up, and this year our enrollment is down, but our admits are up. So students are waiting to enroll, and I think part of that is that they just don't know what's going to happen. And so we need to make sure that we're communicating to them how we're thinking around this. But I'm hopeful. The recent, I think you're talking to people with 3 very different political situations where they are. Our governor just decided to not use the modeling that the University of Arizona and ASU had been working on, and rather we're going to use the federal modeling that no one has seen. And he's using that as a way to open things up more quickly. So that's troubling, I should say. But as Renee said, we don't know.
Yeah, of course.
It's going to be complicated.
Yeah.
Because, it's going to be a dial, not a switch. And if we choose to go one way, we need to be able to shut things down or open things up depending on what happens, right? So, Mark, in your scenario, which I like a lot, the idea of modular stuff, is that then you've got the student from India that might need to quarantine for 2 weeks, right? They're healthy and they're in Arizona, but they can't interact with anybody for 2 weeks. And so, how are you going to figure that, or the housing, and, or like you're in the middle of your in-person thing and an outbreak happens on campus and everybody has to go away for 2 weeks until they can do deep cleaning. And, so it's going to be comparatively much more complicated. We have a little more time to plan than the suddenness of what happened to us this spring, but it's actually because we're going to have to plan for not just multiple scenarios, but the ability to switch between multiple scenarios as we dial up and down. It's more complicated than anything I've ever had to face, I would say that. Right now, what we've done at the College of Built Environments, because we have architecture, planning, construction management, real estate, landscape, we've actually volunteered to help provide some expertise and supplement the facilities planning people who are looking to see whether which spaces can be used to teach what types of formats to how many students, and just get a humongous inventory of, we have some rules of thumbs of how you can do a lecture room that's sized for 100 students can fit 25. And, but we don't, you have to do a different calculation for, say, like a library reading room or a dormitory common room. So, if you're going to start looking at spaces all through campus, and then you also have to think about the ventilation. So that's another tactical, logistical aspect that has to also be considered if we talk about any hybrid, that we have to keep our students safe, and we have to keep our cleaning people safe, and we have to keep our faculty safe. And so, being able to, even if no outbreaks happen, to be able to hold classes and with the proper distance, proper ventilation, proper cleaning between things, it's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's just summarize this by saying everybody's hedging their bets, right? The universities are hedging their bets, faculties are hedging their bets, students and their families are hedging their bets. Everybody's kind of looking at the other person, trying to figure out what's going to be going on. There's a lot of intricacy, as Renee is starting to detail, and Marc, has mentioned in terms of visas and that sort of thing. So how this rolls out is going to be very different for all these different types of schools. If you're a large public school, it's very different than if you're a small private Ivy League school or something like that, where it's just the numbers and the issues are incredibly different, and it's really revealing how different these schools are rather than how similar they are. So it's going to be a complicated rollout. I know some schools are thinking about not being in session in the fall and doing like spring and summer sessions so that everybody stays on the same kind of curriculum. You can't just skip the fall, of course. You can't just skip third year comprehensive studio or something like that. So there's a lot of different implications of this. And it's going to vary regionally about, Boston, New York. I mean, there's still hotspots, and they might be for quite some time. And so it's very early to tell. But the one thing we know is that it's going to be a very complicated and intricate set of decisions for sure.
Well, I want to thank the three of you for coming on today. I know that you're incredibly busy, and I know this scheduling is always not easy either. And I think hearing your thoughts has been very fascinating. I'm sure listeners and viewers are going to appreciate it. So thanks for coming on the show, and thanks for, it's also refreshing, and I think it's exciting to know that we got to talk about some of the bigger issues about education. So it's all great. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
You well, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this week's episode of the Midnight Charette, and thanks to our three guests. Really exciting that we're able to speak to different people now with Zoom, and I think they had very interesting thoughts. And I have to say, it's reassuring that there are people in these leadership positions who are thinking about what it's like to be a student from like a student's perspective in the 21st century, but also the kind of emotional components and students wanting to get away from this kind of authoritarian studio culture and things like this. So it's very exciting. I think it was very exciting to see what the people in charge are working on to make things happen. Kind of seeing what's happening behind the scene, so to speak. I think it was very good. If you like what we're doing, then please leave us a review. That's the best way to support the show. That is leaving a review on iTunes or the podcast app. If you don't know how to do it, just go to our website, which is midnightcharette.com, and there's a tutorial. It's pretty straightforward. Also, we are on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube on occasion. You can show us some love by liking videos, commenting, and things like this. And you can find us on all Instagram, Facebook, for sure. We also have a hotline. If there is anything you want us to be talking about in an episode that is upcoming, you can call the number or text, leave a voicemail. The number is 213-222-6950. If you leave a voicemail, we will play during recording and try and have a pretty deep conversation around it to answer it as best as we can. You can also, suggest any guests you would want to see on the show, or even just share funny stories, anything really. Absolutely. And again, we really appreciate that you are listening. I know that some of you are new and some of you have been listening to us for quite some time, which is amazing, and it means a lot to us, and we'll keep moving forward with this. And that's it for now, right? Okay. That's it for now. Cool. We will talk to you again next week or sooner. Bye. Bye-bye.